What's good, everyone, and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're reacting to the Spongebob Conspiracy Compilation. This is the third part. We're going to go over the Mrs. Puff Dark Secret Theory. Mrs. Puff Dark Secret, aka the Mrs. Puff Theory, and the mini theory this time is going to be part 2 of it. So I guess there's going to be new pieces of evidence and all this and all that. That's enough to actually be added into a mini theory. That's at least what I'm thinking. Like the previous theory, it's still in my head here and there. I took a break. As I mentioned in the first part, I'm going to be watching this whole thing through from beginning to end and going to be putting everything in different parts. So yeah, that said, be sure to give Alex Bale some love and support for the videos that he's made and like their own separate videos, this video, and his 8 mini theories. Also, I keep forgetting to mention this, but the link to this long video is going to be down in the description below. So yeah, it's going to be down there if you want to see the whole thing yourself, and then come every week to see my reaction to it. I don't know what I'm going to do about this compilation video. I might put it Monday and then just call it a day, or maybe I'll put it on a Tuesday and call it the video for that day. I don't know for sure. Tell me what you think in the comment section below. I'd like to hear your opinion on the matter. And speaking in the comment section, if there's any videos you want me to react to, put it down there and I'll react to it as soon as possible. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to support the channel and the content provided, and the notification button to be notified immediately when a new video comes out. Now with this all said, I'm not going to really talk all that much about the theory unless it's like new details, information, or added parts. Because it would just sound like stereo from comparing it to the previous conspiracy involving this. And yeah. But yeah, with that said, let's go on, shall we?
This is not Mrs. Puff. You may think she's just SpongeBob's boating teacher, but you'd be very, very wrong. For years, she's been running from her dark and mysterious past, but it's finally caught up to her. And behind it all is a mastermind who's been secretly controlling her life and psychologically torturing her. If you guys thought my last 2 theories were mind-blowing, get ready for my biggest conspiracy yet. This is the Mrs. Puff theory. Now, a lot of people have been asking, Alex, how do you come up with these crazy conspiracy theories? Well, I always start these theories by looking for the moments in the show that seem to be implying more than they're letting on. Like I've said before, SpongeBob is a weird show with lots of abstract humor, but I can usually understand the intent the writers had behind a weird joke. But then there's stuff like this.
I hope I still remember how to do this. Yeah.
And it's so confusing and weird that it feels like the writers are trying to imply something beyond just weirdness for the sake of comedy. And nowhere in the show is there more of these moments than with Mrs. Puff. And once I started looking into it, it led me down the deepest rabbit hole I've ever seen from this show. So, let's begin. Mrs. Puff is a boating school teacher in Bikini Bottom. She's passed all of her students except for one, SpongeBob SquarePants. He's taken her driver's test hundreds of times and he always ends up failing it and causing destruction and chaos that usually ends up with Mrs. Puff going to jail, despite it not really being her fault. We also know that she was once married, but her husband was killed by fishermen.
That's my driving teacher, Mrs. Puff.
Mrs. Puff? Oh, she's married.
Oh no, Mr. Krabs, she's single.
Then what happened to Mr. Puff?
Ooh.
She doesn't like to talk about it.
Throughout the show, there are moments like this that seem to be hinting at her having a dark, mysterious past. And in Season 2, Episode 10, No Free Rides, we get the biggest clue about who Mrs. Puff really is. After SpongeBob fails the driving test yet again, Mrs. Puff has just had it with him and ends up just giving up and giving him his license even though he never really passed. She quickly realizes that this is a horrible idea and he'll probably end up destroying the entire town.
So much destruction. This reporter asks, why? Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor who...
Remember this clip, because it's going to be very important later on. And then she says this insanely revealing line.
What have I done? Everyone will know that I let him slide through school. I'll have to move to a new city, start a new boating school with a new name. No, not again.
No, not again. Come on, it's like they're just begging someone to make a theory about this. So we now know Mrs. Puff was originally from a different town, she used to own a different boating school, and Mrs. Puff isn't even her real name. There's something in her past that she ran away from. Now, there's been some debate over whether she's actually referring to a new name for herself or for her boating school, but I do think she's talking about her own name, because if she's trying to run away from something in her past, she wouldn't start a new boating school with her real name in the title. Now, when she says again, I don't think she's just referring to starting a new life.
Everyone will know that I let him slide through school. Not again.
I think at her previous boating school, she had a terrible student just like SpongeBob who she prematurely gave a license to, and it led to something so terrible happening that she had to run away and start a whole new life. In Season 3, Episode 5, Doing Time, we get a flashback to when she first opened up the school.
Where did I go wrong? With the opening of my new boating school, I pledge that as long as a student is willing to learn, I shall never give up.
Hi, I'm SpongeBob SquarePants.
With the opening of this new boating school, let's keep in mind that this is not her first boating school. Maybe the whole reason she's making this pledge now at her second school is because she gave up on a student at her previous school, and that led to her having to run away and start a new life. She's pledging to never make the same mistake again. Now let's skip ahead to one of the newer episodes. Season 12, Episode 21, Lighthouse Louie, where Mrs. Puff has SpongeBob organize all the stuff she keeps in the school's
I remember
lighthouse.
that one.
There's lots of interesting things hidden in the background, but the first thing that caught my eye was this file labeled Mrs. Puff. It makes sense for a teacher to have files on all their students, but why would she have a file about herself? But let's remember, she's not Mrs. Puff. That's a fake identity she created, and I'm willing to bet all of her fake identification documents are in this file. Hey, Alex from the future here. This is actually the file from Mrs. Puff You're Fired that shows all the time she's failed to pass SpongeBob, but let's be honest, this was the least impressive evidence in this lighthouse.
I actually forgot about that episode. I'm not gonna lie, that episode completely went over my head when it came to this theory. Jeez. So basically, this is her file as a teacher for Bikini Bottom. Okay. This is actually explaining some stuff. This is giving information. This is saying some details that that I haven't noticed and neglected to remember. So yeah, okay, that's actually pretty cool, all honesty.
So I think it's fine. But that's not the only hint about Mrs. Puff's past in this lighthouse. There is something in here that directly confirms all of this. As SpongeBob swallows all of Mrs. Puff's junk, we see something very interesting for only a few frames. Deranged boat teacher makes getaway. 10 seasons later, and the creators are still hiding stuff about Mrs. Puff fleeing her old life. It might not look like it at first, but we actually get a ton of new information from this newspaper. This is from the New Kelp Post, which tells us Mrs. Puff originally lived in New Kelp City. Then there's a caption that reads, distracts authorities with balloon animals. And do you remember that clip from the beginning?
I hope I still remember how to do this.
Yeah. So whenever Mrs. Puff makes a getaway or commits a crime, she leaves behind a balloon animal to distract the police. I'm telling you guys, these writers don't just do stuff randomly, they have reasons for everything. Okay, so before we move on, let me talk about this newspaper. This was by far the most direct, unambiguous piece of evidence the show has ever given us for a theory, and I have never found anything else like it in the entire show. It's the white whale of SpongeBob theory evidence. But would you believe me if I told you that this newspaper actually has more hidden information inside of it that I missed? If we look at the storyboard for this episode, we can see the newspaper originally had even more information about Mrs. Puff. Obviously the big one.
Okay, let me read this. February 1997, New Kelp Post. Range boat teacher makes getaway, distracts authorities with balloon animals. There's the image. Here's an image of her, Bobby Blowfish. That's Mrs. Puff's real name. That's an interesting last name. But it looks like, I'm just gonna call her Mrs. Puff. Seems like Mrs. Puff, was running away from the police, jumped out and like, something happened. But I think a bit before the chase happened, to buy her some time, she used balloon animals to distract the police. Okay, that's an interesting one.
We now finally know Mrs. Puff's real name. Bobby Blowfish. Originally, we only had the date the newspaper was published, but now we have the year. This is the same year that the SpongeBob pilot came out. And finally, we now know how Mrs. Puff escaped the cops chasing her. In the bottom picture, we see her heading towards a cliff with a sign that says Rock Bottom, a place that only the most skilled drivers could navigate. How is there still so much hidden lore in this newspaper? And the most damning piece of evidence from this newspaper is actually the picture of Mrs. Puff. Kind of a strange photo, right? We have seen this exact same photo of her before. In the episode No Free Rides, when she imagines what would happen if SpongeBob got his license.
Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor.
It's the monster! Oh, you're right! Holy fuck, bro! This is a conspiracy! This is real!
This means that this isn't just her imagination of what might happen. This is also her remembering what happened when she lived in New Kelp City and prematurely gave one of her students a license. And I'm willing to bet that the fish reporting the news is the exact same one who reported about her in New Kelp City. Let me explain. We know from the episode Whatever Happened to SpongeBob that reporters from the Bikini Bottom News can also work for the New Kelp City News. But the real reason I think this is because of his hair. In the entire show, we have never seen this fish reporter with hair before. Why would the creators go out of their way to add that detail? Because Mrs. Puff isn't imagining him as he looks now. She's remembering him from years ago when he used to have hair, when he reported about her in New Kelp City. But how does he have hair if he's a robot? Alright, listen, when you make 8 crazy different theories, sometimes they're not all gonna perfectly line up, okay? What are you gonna do? Mrs. Puff has been running.
Yeah, I can't blame him for that bit. You're literally asking a guy to get everything down to a perfect T. There's bound to be at least 1 or 2 mistakes when it comes down to making a whole frickin' theory about something. I mean, can you really blame the guy? I think someone out there's just really gonna just say, yeah, you can. What are you gonna do? Honestly, what are you gonna do? But, yeah, I can see where he's going with what he means.
From her past ever since, and is now forced to relive her experience with an unteachable student through SpongeBob. But reliving this trauma has pushed her to the point of complete insanity. And trust me when I say that you have no idea how delusional she actually is. Another running gag throughout the series is Mrs. Puff's occasional nervous breakdowns or moments of insanity because of SpongeBob, and they get more severe as the show continues. At first she did care for SpongeBob, but in the newer episodes she literally tries to kill SpongeBob just to get him out of her life. Even SpongeBob just walking up to her gives her severe PTSD.
Hi, Mrs. Puff.
Hit the brakes! SpongeBob! Watch the tree! Laugh!
Wait, Mrs. Puff. We're not driving.
But these mostly seem like just one-off moments, and for the most part, Mrs. Puff is still a functioning member of society, right? I'm going to show you that she's actually much more insane and delusional than you may think. And some of the episodes she's in take place entirely in her own head. If we're talking about how insane Mrs. Puff is, there is no better place to start than the episode Doing Time. Once again, SpongeBob fails the boating test and causes destruction and chaos, which leads to Mrs. Puff going to jail. SpongeBob keeps breaking into jail to try and bust her out, but Mrs. Puff actually prefers being in jail over teaching him. We actually get another interesting line about Mrs. Puff's past in this episode.
Okay, you can do this, Puff. You can get through this without losing your sanity. Oh, that's a road we don't want to go down again.
So we know that Mrs. Puff has lost her sanity in the past, probably from her previous terrible student. But it seems like she's recovered since then, except in this episode she has a complete mental breakdown. SpongeBob keeps appearing in impossible places until she gets thrown into solitary confinement, where each wall of the room transforms into a giant SpongeBob face. And then the episode ends in a way that's so weird and confusing that it rivals the infamous gorilla episode ending. As Mrs. Puff freaks out, she's suddenly transported back into the beginning of the episode when SpongeBob was taking the test. Except this time, SpongeBob gets arrested instead of her.
Help! Help! No! This is not a good time! No!
I can't believe it. It was all a dream. I'm not going to jail.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time.
Forget it.
So what's really going on in this episode? Was the ending all in her head? Is Mrs. Puff just caught in an endless loop? I think this entire episode is inside of Mrs. Puff's head, and she's actually on the outside the whole time, but she's been imagining herself inside of prison. I can explain. Listen closely to what the police officer tells Mrs. Puff.
I'm not going to jail.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time.
Why would you go to jail? You already did your time. And then revealing she's still in a prison uniform despite being on the outside. So this scene is obviously inside of her head, which means everything we see is symbolic. And if we can understand the symbolism of it, we can understand what's really going on with Mrs. Puff. Notice how she's suddenly wearing a black and white striped prison uniform, even though the entire episode she's been wearing this orange jumpsuit. Why would the creators go to the extra effort to draw a whole new prison uniform for her? Well, we've seen her wear this black and white prison uniform before, the very first time she went to prison back in Season 1, Episode 7, Hall Monitor. So when the police officer says, "You've already done your time," he's referring to the first time she went to jail. But why is she still wearing that uniform outside of prison? Well, she may have gotten out of jail, but she was by no means free. Having to teach SpongeBob is a prison in itself, and she manifests that by believing she's in jail and wearing a prison uniform despite being on the outside. This entire episode, every time SpongeBob magically appears, is all inside of her head. She is completely delusional, and hints that she's experiencing these hallucinations don't stop there. Just 6 episodes later, she goes to a house party SpongeBob throws, and while everyone is talking and having a good time, in the background we see she's literally sitting by herself talking to an ice sculpture of SpongeBob. You can't tell me this isn't intentional. I mean, look at this. By herself.
No f***ing way!
It's actually pretty cool to see all these other people reacting to this, to all these different theories. It's actually pretty cool, at least to me. It's a really cool thing to see. But I have to admit, it's kind of crazy to see all this come about. So yeah.
You're lying. You're lying. You're lying. That is insane. That is actually insane.
Now, back in the episode No Free Rides, there is a very strange picture inside of Mrs. Puff's home. It's a picture of Mrs. Puff inside of a picture of Mrs. Puff inside of a picture of Mrs. Puff, creating an infinite loop. This is something that has confused SpongeBob fans for years. But like everything in the show, there is a reason for it being there. One of the SpongeBob storyboard artists actually called it the biggest mystery in the entire show. If you think about it, this is just like the end of Doing Time, where she's stuck in an infinite loop of SpongeBob failing the driving test. Because it's all symbolic of what her life is, just an endless cycle of SpongeBob taking the test and failing, and no matter what she does to try and escape, she always ends up back in the same place at the end of the episode. So this picture is another symbolic manifestation of what she's feeling. We even see another one of these pictures all the way in Season 9, Episode 5, Bumper to Bumper. And hey, we got another one in Season 13, Potato Puff. This is something that the show is consistently alluding to. Mrs. Puff is an unreliable narrator, and anything we see with her could potentially all be inside of her own head. In fact, I believe I found another episode that takes place inside of her head. In Season 9, Episode 17, SpongeBob Long Pants, SpongeBob goes to a different boating instructor and actually gets his license. But as soon as he does, we briefly cut to Mrs. Puff waking up.
You pass.
I finally got my driver's license!
Lock your doors, bar your windows, it's the end of the world!
Now, this seems like it's probably just a throwaway gag where Mrs. Puff somehow senses that SpongeBob got his license, and it causes her to wake up and freak out. You know, it's a good bit, it's funny, but I have a question. If the joke is that she's supposed to be waking up at the exact time SpongeBob gets his license, how come she wakes up at night when SpongeBob clearly gets his license during the day? Because this entire episode actually takes place inside of Mrs. Puff's head, and this is the only part of the episode in the real world.
Damn.
I don't know what that was all about, but I'm glad it's over.
Originally, I paused the theory here to explain how we're able to see her hallucinations, even though I claim the show's supposed to be a nature documentary in my television theory. But if everything's supposed to be from a camera, then how are we seeing things from inside Mrs. Puff's head? In fact,
It goes back to the imagination theory. I know. That's the only thing that would make sense in this case scenario. The imagination theory is the answer, since, after all, the imagination theory, as mentioned, makes things that you imagine come to reality. So, yeah.
How do we see dreams and flashbacks and thought bubbles? But I already explained that in my new imagination mini theory, so definitely check that one out if you missed it. It adds a whole new layer to why Mrs. Puff is hallucinating so much. Back to the theory, we know that her insanity has caused her to live a life of delusion, but if you remember back to the Lighthouse episode, she's also become an extreme hoarder, and looking at her collection of junk is like a look directly into her mind, so there's gotta be something we can learn about her from it. There's a picture of her boyfriend, Mr. Krabs, the hall monitor belt she gives her students, the mean drawings her students make her, SpongeBob's diary, a boating safety helmet. Wait, SpongeBob's diary? Why does she have SpongeBob's diary? The last time we saw that, it was safely put away in SpongeBob's library. What's it doing in her lighthouse? And why does she have Squidward's painting? And a table from the Krusty Krab? And SpongeBob's bike? And Squidward's teddy bear? And the hair curlers Mr. Krabs had? Okay, so technically those were originally Mrs. Puff's hair curlers.
Even Mrs. Puff's hair curlers?
That one was a gift.
But it's implied that Mr. Krabs stole them from her, so her having them now probably means she stole them back. It still works for the point I'm trying to make.
I mean, if you think about it like that, yeah, that makes sense. Basically, a whole thing where he stole them, she got them back. Yeah. Unless, she tried to woo him, if you know what I mean about that. Probably not. Just making a point there. Just saying.
And that statue of Squidward, and that diamond ring, and that crown, and that bucket of radioactive waste, and that jellyfish sign? Oh my god. Mrs. Puff is a kleptomaniac. Mrs. Puff has been stealing from everyone in Bikini Bottom. I can even prove that her pet snail from season 3 episode 19 was stolen.
My snail is up a tree. I've had her since I was a little girl. No!
You've had that snail since you've been a little girl, huh? Then how come that is the exact same snail Squidward had 4 episodes ago in the Great Snail Race?
I wouldn't let Snelly here play with that mongrel mutt. She's a purebred. See, she even has her own papers.
He even has her paperwork. Mrs. Puff clearly stole the snail from Squidward. But why the hell would Mrs. Puff steal all this other junk? What possible use could she have for any of it? We could find the answer to that question by looking at this green hat and this purple jacket. These were gifts Mr. Krabs bought her on their first date, but she ended up feeling uncomfortable receiving them and gave them back to him.
I'm afraid I just don't feel comfortable accepting all these gifts.
Except apparently she's not too uncomfortable to steal them back afterwards. So clearly Mrs. Puff isn't stealing this stuff because she wants to use it. She just steals for the thrill of it. Maybe stealing things is her way of coping with the insanity of her everyday life. And remember, this isn't the first time she's gone insane.
You can get through this without losing your sanity. Oh, that's a road we don't want to go down again.
In fact, I have reason to believe that she started stealing things way back whenever she first went insane.
I hope I still remember how to do this.
I don't think she's just talking about remembering how to make balloon animals. She's probably also referring to remembering how to steal a boat. And if that's not enough for you, in a SpongeBob comic book, she actually admits that she used to rob banks, and she wears the exact same ski mask. Ooh, and we can see the ski mask in the newspaper storyboard. That's cool. Mrs. Puff lives a completely delusional and miserable life, all because she has to teach SpongeBob how to drive. It's led her to steal from the people she cares about and completely disassociate from reality. But that begs a very important question. If SpongeBob is causing her life to be so miserable, then why does she even keep teaching him? After all the destruction and pain he's caused, she'd totally be justified to expel him, right? I mean, she will literally try and kill him so she doesn't have to teach him, but for some reason she can't just expel him. It's almost like there's someone forcing her to teach SpongeBob. Back to the episode No Free Rides, after prematurely giving SpongeBob a license, she steals his boatmobile so he can't hurt anyone. In the end, this causes her to get arrested and go to jail, but then SpongeBob tells her this.
And besides, the warden says she'll let you go early if you do her a favor.
What's that?
Free driving lessons!
She'll get to leave prison early if she gives free driving lessons. That seems like an oddly specific requirement. And that's not the only time this gets mentioned either. In Season 9, Episode 5, Bumper to Bumper, we get this scene.
If only SpongeBob could pass his boating test, he'd be out of my life once and for all. Unfortunately, I keep getting reminded of the consequences if I get too angry with the little nuisance.
Consequences? Are you telling me that if she refuses to teach SpongeBob specifically, she'll be violating her parole and get sent back to jail? Why does the prison even care if Mrs. Puff teaches SpongeBob? Is it just part of some weird community service? But things start to get really suspicious at the end of Season 7, Episode 5, Summer Job. Once again, Mrs. Puff ends up in jail, but this time she's forced to go to a prison boating school.
Oh, wow! A driver's education class!
Good day, class.
I must be having a nightmare! What's he doing here?
Dear Mrs. Puff, I'm following in your footsteps and got a job as a driver's ed teacher for the summer.
Who in their right mind would hire SpongeBob to do this after he's literally destroyed the city countless times while driving? Is this just another one of Mrs. Puff's delusions? Or is the prison intentionally forcing her to be around SpongeBob just to torture her? I mean, look at the way the guard forces her to sit there and listen to him.
Yeah.
Get me out of here!
And look at that evil smile he has as he watches her endure this torture. There is something very strange going on with this prison. Then, in Season 10, Episode 8, The Getaway, Mrs. Puff meets a criminal named Dorsal Dan and starts to get romantic feelings for him. This is also while she's still dating Mr. Krabs. Shame on you, Mrs. Puff. At the end of the episode, they both accidentally land in prison, and the warden puts him in solitary confinement.
Warden, I found this one pulling up outside the prison. Dorsal Dan, a notorious getaway driver. Toss him the clink.
I'll wait for you, my little tenderfoot.
She says tenderfoot here, by the way, because he was really good at driving. A lot of people thought she said.
Wait, what? Oh. That is, wow. That is not something, wow. I did not expect to hear something like that at all today. I really didn't expect to hear it at all. Wow. Mrs. Puff, you are, yes, wow. You know what?
Did
Just go.
something else.
Just go.
In or out of jail, this prison will stop at nothing to make sure she is alone and miserable. But why? Who's behind all of this? Why would anyone care this much about torturing Mrs. Puff? Who's the mastermind pulling the strings? Well, maybe it has something to do with her old life in New Kelp City. Maybe she crossed someone and they've been plotting their revenge ever since. But I've looked in every single frame of New Kelp City, and there is nothing connecting it back to the prison. I've looked literally everywhere, and there's not a single person from the city that has anything to do with Mrs. Puff. Well, I mean, maybe except for the literal warden of the prison she's being kept in! He may be hiding slightly off screen, but that is clearly the same warden of the Bikini Bottom prison. And this isn't some random background character that the show reuses all the time. He is a very distinct character. You can call me out on the Squilliam video all you want, but not this time. I've got some new thoughts on this mastermind warden theory, but I'll save them for the next mini theory. But wait a second. If the warden was originally from New Kelp City, then he'd probably know about Mrs. Puff's dark past and her true identity. So why hasn't he exposed her? He's just kept quiet about the fact that one of his inmates is living a completely false identity. She'd probably even get more prison time when they find out who she really is, so why hasn't he said anything? This is where things get very interesting. So, we know Mrs. Puff prematurely gave a student at her original boating school a license, and that led to them causing chaos and destruction. Maybe this student accidentally did something terrible to the warden, and he's blamed Mrs. Puff ever since. Whatever happened was so terrible that it caused him to move to Bikini Bottom and get a job as the warden of the town's prison. And to his surprise, he finds out that one of his inmates is actually the person he blames for that terrible thing happening. This works out perfectly for him. He can finally get his revenge on Mrs. Puff by making her life miserable. All he has to do is reveal her dark secret, and she'll be stuck in jail for much longer. Except for one small issue with his plan. Mrs. Puff actually likes being in prison.
One day down, 2,528 to go. Oh, that's just shy of 4 years without SpongeBob. I'm going to enjoy this.
So, he comes up with a new plan. Keep Mrs. Puff secret and let her out of prison early, but only under the condition that she has to teach SpongeBob. He's literally turning her normal life into a prison. And he makes sure going back to prison to avoid SpongeBob isn't even an option for her anymore, because he'll make sure that SpongeBob is always in there with her. And he's not gonna let her escape and start a new life like she did in New Kelp City. He makes sure to give her an ankle bracelet that doesn't let her leave Bikini Bottom.
I can't even leave town without violating my parole.
He is the mastermind who's been controlling everything this entire time. Alright, gonna interrupt here. The warden that told Mrs. Puff she could leave prison if she gave free driving lessons was actually referred to as a female.
And besides, the warden says she'll let you go early if you do her a favor.
So that's my bad. That definitely wasn't the same warden. It doesn't ruin my theory, but like I said, I've got some new ideas for this part that I'll talk about later. But guess what? His insidious plan doesn't even end there. This is not the first time we've seen the warden character. We first see him in season 4, episode 2, Crabs vs. Plankton. In this episode, Plankton slips on some water in the Krusty Krab and decides to sue Mr. Krabs for everything he owns. And then guess who shows up out of nowhere and offers to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer?
What I really need is a good lawyer.
Whoa, did somebody say lawyer? Richard A. Bottomfeeder, attorney at law. I couldn't help but notice that despicable display.
Richard A. Bottomfeeder, the warden of the Bikini Bottom prison, is also apparently a lawyer? That's kind of strange. Those both sound like major careers. You usually wouldn't imagine someone being both. Then he says he'll be Mr. Krabs' lawyer completely free of charge.
So, how much is this gonna cost me?
Actually, I won't charge a dime unless we win.
Well, that's awfully generous of you, Richard. Alright, a lot of people pointed out that this is actually something lawyers
Normally, lawyers don't charge you unless you win. This may seem like a generous thing, but actually some lawyers have this procedure where you only pay them if they lose the case. A minor nitpick, but many lawyers have the unless we win, it's free business model. Okay. Huh. I actually will have to look into that in my free time.
sometimes do, but when you add it up with everything else, it's still kinda suspiciously convenient. That's the point I'm trying to make here. He seems very confident that he can win the case, but right before he goes to court, he slips on some water and says SpongeBob will have to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer now.
Oh, this is gonna be a slam dunk.
Oh no! Mr. Krabs' lawyer, speak to me!
Wrapped with pain, can't move. Looks like you're gonna have to handle this one, son.
He tells SpongeBob that he has to represent Mr. Krabs.
I just saw the yellow thing. I don't really pay attention to the things at times, but I actually looked at it. Man, there was probably a bunch, and actually it does sound like someone faking to be in pain. Just a bit. Not like seriously injured pain, but more like, oh, I fell on the back. Oh, kind of pain. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? I like to say it makes sense, but I do not know for sure.
Even though he himself called SpongeBob a liability.
Actually, SpongeBob, we won't be needing any testimony from you. Why, you'd be more of a liability than an asset.
But it's okay, because apparently all SpongeBob needs to win is inside of Richard's briefcase.
Everything you need to win is in this here case.
Really? Everything?
Except when SpongeBob gets to court, he realizes that Richard never gave him the combination to the case.
It's, all in here.
Really?
Yep, right in here.
Is there a problem?
Your lawyer didn't give me the combination.
Either Richard A. Bottomfeeder is the worst lawyer in history, or this is all part of his elaborate plan to ruin Mrs. Puff's life. Here's what I think happened. First, he finds out that Mr. Krabs is being sued, and he wants to ensure that Mr. Krabs loses the case because he wants to destroy any chance Mrs. Puff has at finding love. So he pretends to be a lawyer, even offering his services for free, something Mr. Krabs can't resist. He makes Mr. Krabs feel confident that they're gonna win the case, and then at the last second, he pretends to get into an accident so he can't represent Mr. Krabs. Instead of finding a real lawyer to replace him, he tells the most incompetent person for the job, SpongeBob, that he has to be Mr. Krabs' lawyer, and he gives him a case that allegedly has all the answers in it without actually giving SpongeBob the combination, setting him up for a total failure in court. Richard A. Bottomfeeder refuses to let anyone get close to Mrs. Puff, not Dorsal Dan, and not Mr. Krabs. This guy has squillion levels of hate for Mrs. Puff. But why? What exactly did her previous student do that warrants this much torture? It can't be something as simple as him or his property getting damaged. It has to be something life-changing. Something like losing a loved one because of the student's reckless driving. And I think the show gives us one last hint about who this might have been. All the pictures of Mrs. Puff's house are very meaningful to her. She's got photos of Mr. Krabs, her pet snail, and of course those infinitely looping photos that told us so much about her mental state. But there is one more photo in this house that might be the key to this entire conspiracy. In season 12, episode 14, Plankton's Old Chum, we see a photo of someone we've never seen before on Mrs. Puff's wall. There's some surprising similarities between this character and Richard. The green color, the red bow tie, the overall fancy, serious appearance. It clearly isn't the same person, but maybe this is someone related to Richard, like a father, a son, or a brother that Mrs. Puff's former student killed. And the reason she keeps a photo of him up is to have a permanent reminder to never make the same mistake of giving someone a license who doesn't deserve it. Mrs. Puff is a boating school teacher who once made a terrible mistake that led to the loss of her business, identity, sanity, and any chance at finding happiness. I like to think that there used to be a time when she was happy, back when her husband was still alive. If only he was still around today, maybe she wouldn't have to face all of this on her own. Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. Is what I would say if I was done, except her husband is still alive.
Wait, what?
In the SpongeBob movie, SpongeBob and Patrick travel to a gift shop named Shell City that's full of dead fish turned into knickknacks and ornaments. Except they end up setting off the smoke detector, which activates the sprinkler system and brings all the dead fish back to life, including a very familiar looking pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Puff is alive. Well, wait a second. If he's alive and he escaped, then why hasn't he gone back to Mrs. Puff? Why is she still alone? Because remember, she ran away from their home in New Kelp City and started a new identity. So sadly, Mr. Puff has no way of finding her. The tragedy in Mrs. Puff's story is that her happiness is just a city away, but she can never even leave town because that would violate her parole. Richard A. Bottomfeeder probably even knows her husband is alive and is making sure they're never reunited. As the name says, Richard really is a bottom feeder.
Incredibly excited because we get to talk to the voice of Karen today.
Damn. Wait, they actually have podcasts? What? That's crazy. Okay. So, let's see if we got all the information we gathered. For one, there wasn't a lot of stuff to really say, mainly because anything that is going to be said is going to be said in the mini-theory. So, there's that bit. Second would be... Yeah, that's really it. That's really it. Anything new about the Mrs. Puff theory is going to be put into the mini-theory. So there wasn't really a lot to really say in this matter, to the point that I was almost silent the whole thing. Well, try to be silent. But yeah, overall, there wasn't a lot to really discuss. So let's see what this podcast is all about.
Today, Jill Talley.
I love trying to make sense out of SpongeBob. My adorable nephew called me up and he just was like, hey, Jill, do you know about this? What do you make of this? Like, what do you think about this Mrs. Puff? And I didn't know what he was talking about. It was like a fever dream because I wasn't aware of all the conspiracy stuff. So all I'm hearing on the phone is criminal, past clues. And I'm going, what is he talking about? I said, I'm going to look into it, Frankie. So then I went online and I started looking at it and it was fascinating.
Wow.
I was in. I was going, I want to know too.
I say it's like top 3. I think this one would be like could be like in top 3. Probably could be second. Maybe tied for first. In personal opinion, I think it aged well enough. Maybe actually it might be number 3. I put number 3 actually. Yeah, I'm thinking about it, and I think it might be 3. If I had to make a personal list, it would be number 3. Yeah, number 3. I'd definitely say number 3. That's actually kind of funny now that I think about it. This is the third conspiracy theory, and it's placing number 3 personally for me. It's kind of funny. Alright.
So, the Mrs. Puff theory. I guess maybe a few people might have watched this one. Yeah, so this is the one that really took off, and for good reason. It's really the one theory where the creators just straight up unambiguously hand us the lore. You know, as opposed to the usual vague details and Easter eggs that may or may not be hinting at something. But how does it hold up now? Well, you might be surprised to hear that I'd probably only put it in 4th place. I think the first 2/3 are really strong, and it could have been one of my best theories, but then I kind of go on this weird tangent in the third part with this random background warden character with a bunch of assumptions and a kinda weak final connection to this vaguely similar picture. I think I just really wanted to give this theory more of a sense of closure and a final big twist, but that ultimately made it feel kind of forced in the end. But I have since ended up coming up with so many new ideas and discoveries for this theory that I decided to just make the next mini-theory just a straight-up Mrs. Puff Part 2. So if we pretend like this new stuff was always part of the theory, I think I'll bump it up to second place where it rightfully belongs. So without further ado, here
The fact you're putting it second, that means this thing has a lot to really go into it.
is the Mrs. Puff theory Part 2.
Alright, wow me. Wow me.
So, there's been a lot of new evidence that's come out about Mrs. Puff since I posted my theory. Some
Obviously,
I already
that makes
added
sense.
to the main theory, like her real name being discovered, so go watch that if you haven't already. But I saved some really cool discoveries and new ideas just for this mini-theory. Like, in Lighthouse Louie, I missed this the first time, but if you look closely in her pile of junk, you can actually see a dead police officer's corpse! Oh my god!
Wait, no, that's...
Actually, no, this is just an obstacle from her training course. But
yeah, it looked like an obstacle. Like, yeah, it didn't look like a real body or anything like that, so no.
I bet you didn't know, in Camp Coral, we see her dispose of the real Mrs. Puff's dead body! Also no, this is just a piñata that looks like her. Okay, but they're clearly trying to mess with us at this point. Before I get into the actual new discoveries, I want to talk about some alternative ideas I've come up with.
I thought Camp Core was like an alternate timeline thing. Different theory if you're gonna ask. You'll see it in, 2. The second theory after, let's see. If I'm doing this like Tuesday, then the Tuesday after next Tuesday. Yeah, that would be the best explanation. But for those that are seeing the compilation, I'm not gonna really, it's like after this next theory that we're gonna see.
For some parts of the Mrs. Puff theory. As I've already said, I'm not the biggest fan of where I took the third part of this theory. I really wanted there to be this big reveal about why the prison is forcing Mrs. Puff to teach SpongeBob, when, in reality, it just makes so much more sense that, like in Doing Time, every time Mrs. Puff sees SpongeBob in jail, she's actually just hallucinating.
Good day, class!
I must be having a nightmare!
You know, there's just way more direct evidence in the show to support this, as opposed to this convoluted warden theory. And it's further supported by my new imagination mini-theory from earlier in this video. We know the show exists in a world where things you imagine can easily come to life. And Mrs. Puff is constantly imagining her fear of SpongeBob or the guilt from her past mistakes. So it makes sense that she would get trapped in her own delusions so often. But there's always been this big loose end in my theory that I've always wanted to find a way to wrap up. We know Mrs. Puff prematurely gave a license to one of her previous students in New Kelp City, and that led to the city being destroyed.
Local consensus places the blame on this negligent, selfish driving instructor.
But who was Mrs. Puff's original student before SpongeBob? And while we haven't gotten any new evidence about this, I think I've got 2 strong candidates for who it could be. One of the best comments I got from the Mrs. Puff video was the idea that the original student was actually SpongeBob's cousin, Stanley S. Squarepants.
Hi, Squidward. I'd like you to meet my cousin Stanley. We're related.
There's 2 of them?
Stanley is a character we meet for only 1 episode in Season 5. He's SpongeBob's cousin from out of town, and he's extremely accident-prone, even more than SpongeBob. Now, we don't know what town he's from, but we know his Uncle Sherm sent him away because he was too destructive. So he totally fits the idea of Mrs. Puff's former student that probably destroyed New Kelp City. It would also add another layer to why Mrs. Puff is so tortured by SpongeBob specifically. He would literally look and act exactly like her former student.
There's 2 of them?
So yeah, I think this is totally plausible. Great comment. The only thing that
I mean, I can see it, but there's like one big issue with this whole thing. I like to say that it's true, but here's the counterpoint. If Stanley was said student, I think Mrs. Puff by now would have said a comment about it, even if it was very, very vague. Like a comparison between the two that isn't like completely obvious. At least that's what I think about the matter.
Anna holds this theory back is the lack of any actual concrete connection between Stanley and Mrs. Puff. Like,
Exactly.
unfortunately, they're never in the same episode. But I think I have another possible candidate for this mystery student. Someone who we actually see interact with Mrs. Puff. In the Mrs. Puff theory, I theorize that the entire episode Doing Time was all imagined by Mrs. Puff, and everything we see, even small details like her changing prison uniforms, are symbolic for what's really going on inside of her head. But if that's true, then what does this random other prisoner that keeps showing up symbolize?
Hey there, Puff Mama. What's today's grub?
Hi, Donna. It's chilly.
I wouldn't have thought much about it if it wasn't for this very interesting moment where she returns at the end of the episode.
Oh, it's just my imagination again.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
I think this could be implying that Donna is Mrs. Puff's original student. We see her driving Mrs. Puff's boat in a free-fall crash, just like her old student probably also did. And then she literally gets replaced by SpongeBob.
So what's for dinner tonight, Puff Mama? Chili?
Forget it.
Just like how we actually replaced her original student. So yeah, I think both Donna and Stanley are pretty good candidates for the original student. Stanley is a bit more thematically fitting, but Donna actually has some direct evidence in the show. So yeah, I could see it being either of them. But that's all just tying up loose ends. The real reason I decided to cover Mrs. Puff again in this mini-theory is because of two major new developments in recent SpongeBob episodes.
I mean, the detail about the students, that's pretty interesting. But this, Arbor Day Disarray, in historical history. The historical history sounds pretty interesting, since that could just be like an episode where it goes talking about certain people's past and their family and all that. It might go about the main characters mainly. So we could probably see like Mr. Krabs, family with their achievements and all that, Mrs. Puff, Larry, Plankton, Squidward, SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, and so on and so forth. So that sounds actually really compelling.
The first is in the season 13 episode, Arbor Day Disarray. In this episode, Sandy gives everyone trees she grew, and we get this scene between Mrs. Puff and her tree.
I love talking to someone who knows how to keep a secret. I can finally tell someone what really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City.
What really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City? They're still adding more mysteries to solve about Mrs.
Okay. That's a thing. That's a thing. So, didn't expect that. So that means it probably wasn't. Oh, wait, no, it's probably a mix of the whole thing and the job she did.
Puff, it sounds like Mrs. Puff did some kind of heist or maybe has some connection to Shell City from the SpongeBob movie. And if you remember, I theorized that Shell City was the place Mr. Puff, her former dead husband, was being held. They end up setting off the smoke detector, which activates the sprinkler system and brings all the dead fish back to life, including a very familiar looking pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Puff is alive. So, is it possible this job is somehow related to Mr. Puff? Well, before we get into that, there is one more new development we need to talk about. In the season 14 episode, Hysterical History, for the very first time ever, we actually do get to definitively see Mr. Puff when he was alive.
Bikini Bottom's own titan of industry, Mr. Puff, ran the first successful boat assembly line.
So, this episode is just a bunch of flashbacks from Bikini Bottom's history, and we learn that Mr. Puff was actually a wealthy businessman who ran a boat factory. And Sandy later confirms that this is all actually true. This isn't just a story SpongeBob made up. Now, Mr. Puff looks and sounds a lot like Mrs. Puff.
Speed up, line number 5.
And the other flashbacks in this episode seem to be about ancestors of our main characters, so maybe this is actually supposed to be just a relative of Mrs. Puff, not...
No, it would have to be Mr. Puff, because, you gotta remember, Mrs. Puff's real name is Bobby Blowfish, not, Mrs. Puff. Okay, actually, now that I think about it, what is her first name? We know Mrs. Puff is, like, the title of a teacher using the last name. So, what is, her first name? Something Puff. Did she keep the name Bobby? No, that wouldn't make sense. That would probably leave a trail, would it?
her dead husband. But remember, Mrs. Puff is not originally from Bikini Bottom, and we know her last name isn't really Puff, it's Blowfish. So this is most likely her former husband, Mr. Puff, before he died. And unfortunately, this does seem to disprove my Mr. Puff theory, because he clearly looks very different than the pufferfish we see in Shell City. But even if this pufferfish wasn't Mr. Puff, I don't think I was wrong about Mr. Puff being at Shell City. The fact that he's shown as a dried up, hanging pufferfish with googly eyes is way too similar to be a coincidence. And then there's the fact that they just confirmed Mrs. Puff has some sort of history with Shell City specifically. I think Mr. Puff was abducted and taken to Shell City, but the reason why we don't see him in the SpongeBob movie is probably because he was already sold to someone else by that point, meaning he was unfortunately never saved by SpongeBob. So that leaves us with one final question. What was the job Mrs. Puff pulled at Shell City, and what does it have to do with her husband's death? Well, my first guess is that this job was some sort of rescue mission to save Mr. Puff from Shell City and she failed, but listen to how she talks about it.
I can finally tell someone what really happened when I pulled that job in Shell City.
Whatever happened at Shell City, she's happy about it. In fact, it's kind of a sinister, nefarious happiness.
What really happened when I pulled that job?
She's not devastated that her husband was lost forever, she's happy about it. I never really considered this before, but could Mrs. Puff actually be responsible for her husband's death?
Whoa.
Did Mrs. Puff kill her husband? I mean, we know Plankton sold Neptune's crown to Shell City.
I just wanted to say thanks again for selling me the crown. I sold it to a guy in Shell City.
So it does seem possible to arrange for this kind of thing to happen. And Arbor Day Disarray ends with Mrs. Puff's tree ratting her out to the police.
Hello, police department? I got a lead on that Shell City job.
I gotta go.
Why would the Bikini Bottom police care about something she did at a human gift shop? I mean, they didn't care when SpongeBob stole from there. The only explanation...
Yeah, that would make sense. SpongeBob and Patrick were considered heroes for doing what they did and being able to, save them and all that. It just seems like too much of a coincidence.
Is that she wasn't stealing from humans, she was giving them something, or someone, from Bikini Bottom. Mr. Puff. Mrs. Puff arranged for fishermen to kidnap and kill her husband. That's what really happened at Shell City. But why? Well, other than Mr. Puff kind of seeming like a jerk who mistreats his employees, he's also very wealthy, which means that when he died, in a way that can't be traced back to Mrs. Puff, as his wife, she would inherit his money. Which explains how Mrs. Puff, who previously had to abandon her entire life and start over from scratch in Bikini Bottom, could afford to open a massive boating school. Maybe this was her plan all along. Get close to some rich jerk, marry him, and then have him killed to inherit his money. These little breadcrumbs they've given us have told us so much more about Mrs. Puff's past. But also, maybe, just maybe, her future as well. Mr. Puff was portrayed as a greedy, unethical capitalist who only cared about money, even at the expense of his employees. And does that remind you of anyone else in Mrs. Puff's life?
I one hand that penny or the arm comes off. Keep on trucking, SpongeBob.
How could you trade SpongeBob for 62 cents?
You think I could have gotten more?
If she did it to Mr. Puff, who's to say she's not planning to do it again to Mr. Krabs? Maybe this is the entire reason why she's dating him. Let's just hope Mr. Krabs isn't planning on getting married anytime soon. The imaginary doppelganger Mr. Krabs, that is. And
That would be the
is
complete
the
joke
Mrs.
of it,
Puff
wouldn't it?
Theory Part 2.
Wow. So, the reason why Mrs. Puff left was a mixture of a job she did for Shell City and her former student causing chaos. Yep, damn, that's a really interesting thing to hear. That is kind of crazy, but yet it's also kind of believable, to say the least. Why? Probably greediness and all that. I mean, she is a kleptomaniac, so maybe stealing money was like the next best big thing. I mean, she is a hoarder. Yeah, that actually might make sense. But yeah, that's a crazy mini theory, and it just adds more to what Mrs. Puff did. That just led to her to lead a new life in Bikini Bottom. Anyway, I hope you'll enjoy this video. If you did, hit the like button down below. Hit the subscribe button to support the channel, support the content provided, and so on and so forth. Hit the notification button, be notified immediately when your video comes out. Man, we got a lot of stuff happening here. Kind of curious to see what the next mini theory is all about. But before then, the next one's going to be the fourth set, being the evolution theory and what was it called? The crab theory. No, wait, the human war mini theory. Oh, that was something else. Never mind. But yes, hope you all enjoyed this video. Be sure to, as I said in the beginning, to give Alex Bale some love and support for the videos that he has made throughout his time making SpongeBob Conspiracy Theories, and hit the like button down below to support. If you like the video, subscribe to support the channel, support the content provided, and notification button be notified immediately when the video comes out. And finally, tell me what you think about this new mini theory. Honestly, it's just like a giving us more of a clear picture on Mrs. Puff's mentality, her thought process, and what just makes her obviously tick. And yeah, the only thing that would make this better would be the fact that if we actually got an idea who her student that destroyed Shell City was. But yeah, with this all said, hope you all enjoy, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!